My name is Mike Franks. I was born in East Cleveland, Ohio, the oldest of three boys, and grew up in a very Catholic home, and attended catechism on Sundays to learn about the Catholic faith. As we got older, my parents stopped attending church, and they would drop us off in front of the Catholic church and then come back a couple hours later and pick us up and expect us to attend. And at the age of about 14 years old, my father left us. And at that point in time, I just stopped attending church altogether and just began a pattern of some really bad choices and behaviors in my life. You know, the Navy was a good choice for me. I had a sense of belonging there, and it put me in a place where I really liked to be. I love airplanes, I love aviation. I got to be in a fighter squadron and work on the aircraft, and ultimately got assigned to an aircraft carrier. I used to really love to go up on the flight deck at night, and being so far away from cities and lights, the stars were just amazing. I don't think I've ever seen a sky of stars anywhere like I did when I was in the Navy on the ship. But I would go up and I'd look at the vastness of the sky and the vastness of the ocean, the vastness of the ship and the smallness of myself, and really try to put together how it all came to be. But the more I reasoned and the more I thought about it, the more the scientific theories made sense. The theory of evolution, the Big Bang, never a creator. And I just got to the point where I guess I really accepted the fact that I was an atheist, that there was no God, that God didn't exist in the universe. Well, my job in the ship was to work in a electronics lab where we repaired the black boxes that went in the airplanes, the electronics. And a couple rows back sat another sailor, a guy that was older than I was. He was from Knoxville, Tennessee, very mature guy. He was married, and began a friendship with him that I really treasured. It seemed to have everything in common. Well, I remember one particular day going back to see him, and he was sitting at his bench, and he had a Bible opened, and in a workbook. He was doing a Bible study of some sort, filling out questions. And I walked up to him and I couldn't believe my eyes. I absolutely cannot believe that this guy was reading a Bible. And I said, what are you doing? And he looked at me as amazed as I was at him, he was at me. And he said, I'm doing my Bible study. Don't you read the Bible? I said, dude, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, you read the Bible? I mean, I was amazed that somebody that was that intelligent could be that dumb, that would commit his belief to something like that. And talked about it for a few minutes, and I found myself just kind of like easing away from him a little bit. Didn't want to really get associated too much with a Jesus freak. And I said, do you really believe that? And he said, well, let me ask you this. Are you 100% sure that God doesn't exist? I mean, if you had to state your eternal destiny on it right at this moment, would you bet that there is no God? And I thought about it, and I said, well, you know what? Maybe 99%. I mean, virtually, I'm sure. And he said, well, that 1% of doubt that you have is your mustard seed. And I said, really? Yeah. He said, that mustard seed is a significant thing for you, because if you plant that mustard seed, it'll change your life. Well, where I sat, I had a piece of test equipment in front of me. It was a console electronics test machine that I used to test my equipment. And the top of it sat about head level with me. And as I sat down in my chair, I looked up and I noticed a big, thick green book sitting on top of my console. And I picked it up and I looked at it, and it was the Living Bible, a big padded cover, fat green thing. And right away I thought, oh man, this guy's going to start hounding me now. He's going to start leaving his stuff where everybody sees it. And I looked at the guy next to me and I said, wow, man, who left this book on my bench? He looked at me kind of funny. He said, are you blind? He said, that book's been there since you came on board the ship this year. It's been there since last year. The guy that had your job the last cruise was a Jesus freak. He left it there. And I thought, this guy's busting on me. I got up and I looked at the top of the console, and sure enough, there was a clean spot where the book sat in the dust. And man, I felt chills run up my spine. I thought, this is the most incredible coincidence I think I can ever remember seeing. But I took the book with me anyway, and that night I opened it up and I read chapter 1 of John. And I thought it was a great story, but I needed to be convinced. I mean, there was nothing convincing about it. It was just a great story. But I read chapter 1, and then the next night, I went to chapter 2. And I continued to read, and I got to chapter 18. And Jesus had been seized and taken before the high priest, who insulted him, interrogated him, talked down to him, and ultimately slapped him across the face. And it was like a slap to me when I read that. I put the book down, and I remember thinking, how in the world could somebody slap the face of the creator of himself? How could he slap the son that God sent down to save the world? And I felt those chills again, and I said, man, what am I talking about? This is fiction. This is crazy. It's old nonsense. And the funny thing is, something had happened. Something had changed within me. I believed those words. I believed that he was the Son of God. I don't know what happened. It wasn't something that I felt come over me, but I put the book away, and I just began a period of a couple days of real fear. I just tried to run from it, tried to deny it, but it wasn't where I could get away. I remember one night not being able to sleep, and I went up to the shop, and as fate would have it, it was Good Friday. We were out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and I went upstairs into the shop, and we had a TV lounge in the back. Back then we had a closed circuit TV in the ship, and there was always a movie playing on one channel. And I went into the lounge, and I looked around, and there was nobody there. And I thought, wow, this is really odd. Everybody should be in there having a cigarette, watching TV. And it soon became apparent why they weren't in the room. Up on the TV, they were playing some type of a story of the Bible. I think it was the greatest story ever told. And I looked up at the screen, and at the moment I looked, I saw the high priest slap Jesus in the face. Man, he had my attention. I walked out of the room, I went up on the flight deck, and I remember going through the dark passageways, thinking to myself, where can I go to run from God? How can I hide from him? I mean, he's real. He answered my prayer, he acknowledged himself. I know that he created me, and what can I do about it? And I acknowledged to myself that, hey, I believe this. And I couldn't wait till the next day to come and tell my friend. And I said, something happened to me last night, and I believe. I believe. Well, he looked at me, and just the most joyful smile came over his face. And he said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, I don't know. What do I need to do about it? And he said, well, dying people can believe in their medicine, but if they don't take it, it's not going to save their life. And I said, well, how do I take it? And he said, well, I need you to pray with me. And he prayed this prayer of salvation. And I accepted Jesus as my Savior. And I can tell you that it changed my life. It began a different course for me from that point forward. The Sunday after I made the decision to accept Christ in my life was Easter Sunday. And my friend invited me to go to church. On the aircraft carrier, church was whatever space that you could put a church together with. And there was a part of the carrier called the forecastle or forecastle. It was in the front of the ship, and that's where the anchor chains came up through the front of the bow and went down into a locker. And it was a very large open space. And as I walked in there were chairs set up in a big semicircular fashion. I'm going to guess and say maybe it was big enough for 200 or 300 people. And we got there early, of course, and we went up right in the front row is where he took me to sit. And we sat down in a folding chair. And I got to tell you that the thoughts going through my head that day were, what are my friends going to think? We're going to be pulling into port here in a few days. I always get together with the same guys. We always go out and we have a typical Navy Liberty shore party, whatever you want to call it. And that wasn't going to be real consistent with the life of a Christian. And I was really kind of wrestling with how was my life going to change? How deep was I going to make this commitment? Was this unbelievably wonderful feeling that I was feeling going to wear off as soon as we got back on land and my real life began again? I had one particular friend, a guy named Dave, and Dave and I were the best at everything when it came to shore parties. Best drinkers, best fighters, just really had a lot of fun together. And deep in my mind was, how was I going to explain this to Dave? We had conversations more than one time about the sissy Christians on the boat. And here I was now a sissy Christian. What was I going to tell him? Well, we sat down in the front row of the church, and the pastor, of course, he was a chaplain, got up and started to speak the words of the service. And I'll never forget looking up across the row of chairs and looking right into the eyes of my friend Dave, sitting in the front row with a sissy Bible in his hand and a smile on his face. I wasn't the only one God was working on that Chev. And afterwards, I went up to him and I remember he said to me, "Did you ever think that it would feel so good not to be bad?" I remember when my son died, I read, you go through something like that and you want to try to figure it out. You want to try to understand what you're going through, and almost desperately you want to find that there's going to be some healing in the future. There's going to be some peace. But I remember reading that a doctor wrote that if you were going physically through what you're going through mentally right now, you would be in intensive care. And I thought, how can this get better? How can we heal from something like this? And Debbie and I, from the first day that we lost our son, we made a commitment that we weren't going to blame each other, and that we had 3 other children, small children in the house, and that we had to heal from this. We had to have happiness in our home. We had to. They deserved not to grow up in a house full of grief, but they deserved to grow up in a house of joy and a house of love like any other children, and that it was going to be up to us to heal from this. And I drew directly from the pages of this book and from God for answers and how I could deal with my pain and with our pain. And I can tell you that my comfort and my healing came from God's word and from the knowledge that this plan, this book, means that there's a happy ending, even in a tragedy, no matter how horrible it might seem, that there's a happy ending in this tragedy. And through it, God spoke to me many times when I was really at the lowest point, where God would gently speak to me and he would say, "Are you feeling bad for you, or are you feeling bad for your son? Because if you're feeling bad for your son, I got that under control. It's okay. It's okay. If you're feeling bad for you, you need to start looking at me." And that thought, has come through my mind when I feel the desperation of grief, or I feel the sense of loss, that I have to put it all in perspective. And you can't put something like that in perspective without considering God's plan. It's the only real happiness that can come out of something like that. Being a human being, there's pangs of doubt, even to this day, that hit you every once in a while that, how do you know this is real? How do you know that, this isn't just something that you feel, but it really isn't real? And I'll tell you, one of the real affirmations that I received in reading the book from the beginning to the end was the consistency of God's character throughout that book. Thousands of years, and I don't know how many different authors that wrote the pages of this book, but yet through it all, there was a consistency in God's character and in God's nature from the very beginning of Genesis to the very end of Revelation. And I remember the thought coming to me many times that there is no way that anybody could have made this up. There's no way that these authors could have read what was written before them and said, "Gee, I'll add to that," in this consistent fashion. This is not the work of a man's mind, it's the work of a creator. And there's power in these pages. I realize that when I hold it and when I read it. In fact, sometimes there's just such a poetry and beauty to the words that you read. It's precious.